What really happened in the dark waters of the Sea of Abaco on the night of April 4th? How does a healthy 55-year-old woman, an experienced sailor with more than a decade on the water, simply vanish from an 8-foot boat while her husband sits close enough to touch her? Why would a man vow on national television that he would never stop searching for his wife, and then board a flight out of the country within hours of making that promise? And why did federal investigators cross an international border, seize a sailboat on the open ocean, and send evidence to the most advanced forensic laboratory in America, all over what was supposed to be a tragic accident? Everyone following this story has questions. The national networks have fragments, but the full picture, the one federal agents have been quietly assembling piece by piece for 81 days, is a story almost nobody has put together from beginning to end, until now, because tonight we are laying it all out. And by the time we finish, you will understand exactly why investigators believe this case is about to change forever. Before we go any further, if stories like this matter to you, take 1 second to hit that like button and subscribe to True Crime Vic, because we follow cases like this one all the way to the truth, and you will not want to miss what comes next. Everything you are about to hear is drawn from confirmed reporting by CBS News, NBC News, ABC News, Fox News Digital, News Nation, and the reporting of veteran journalist Ashley Banfield on her podcast, Drop Dead Serious. One thing must be stated clearly at the outset. Brian Hooker has denied any wrongdoing through his attorneys. He has not been charged with any crime, and under the law, he is presumed innocent. What follows is the documented record of an active investigation, and where accounts conflict, we will tell you exactly who said what. Our story begins not with the disappearance itself, but with a promise. On April 14th, 10 days after Lynette Hooker vanished into the sea, her husband Brian sat before ABC News cameras in the Bahamas and told the world that finding his wife was his sole focus, no matter how likely or unlikely that outcome might be. He explained that the search had been interrupted by the police investigation, that he understood such things had to happen, but that he intended to return to the water as quickly as possible. He said he would stay until he was ordered to leave or convinced the effort was hopeless, and that he would hire or even beg people to help him look. On camera, he appeared to be a devoted spouse, consumed by a single mission. Hours after that interview ended, Brian Hooker was on a commercial flight leaving the islands. His Bahamian attorney, Terrell Butler, explained that his client's mother was terminally ill and that he needed to be at her side. The timing raised eyebrows for a simple reason. Just 1 day earlier, Brian had walked out of police custody in Freeport after 5 days of detention and questioning. No charges were filed against him, but Royal Bahamas Police Commissioner Shanta Knowles made the department's position plain, confirming that Brian remained a suspect and that the investigation was very much ongoing. Think about what he left behind when that plane lifted off. He left the soulmate, the 46-foot sailboat that had been the couple's full-time floating home. He left the small dinghy where, according to his own account, his wife was alive one moment and gone the next. He left a digital footprint scattered across his electronic devices, coordinates and navigation logs, and timestamps that investigators were already working to extract. And mounted on the mast of that sailboat, he left a piece of technology most people never knew existed, a device worth $33,000, whose significance would not become public for another month. Every single one of those items has since been seized, examined, or made the subject of federal legal process. To understand why, we have to go back to the beginning. Brian and Lynette Hooker came from Onsted, Michigan, a small community where they had built a life together over roughly a quarter-century of marriage. In retirement, they traded solid ground for the open water, selling their home and moving aboard the Soulmate to live at sea full-time. For years, they cruised the American coast and the Caribbean, documenting the journey on social media and a YouTube channel they called The Sailing Hookers. To everyone watching from the outside, it looked like a dream. Lynette was 55 years old, a mother, a daughter, and by every account a capable and confident sailor. A family friend described her to Fox News Digital as the kind of person anyone would be glad to have around, the one who showed up early to help set up and stayed late to clean up, the person you called when you needed a friend. She was not a character in a mystery. She was a real woman with people who loved her, and those people are still waiting for answers. According to what Brian told Bahamian authorities, the evening of April 4th began simply. Around 7:30, he and Lynette climbed into their 8-foot dinghy and departed Hopetown, heading back toward the Soulmate, which sat anchored near Aunt Pat's Bay off Elbow Cay in the Abaco Islands. Somewhere along that short crossing, he said, rough water struck the little boat, and Lynette went overboard. In his telling, she was carrying the key to the engine when she fell, which meant the motor could not be restarted. He described watching the wind and current pull them apart, later writing on Facebook that he was heartbroken over a boating accident in unpredictable seas and high winds, and that despite desperate attempts to reach her, the elements drove them further from one another. What he says happened next stretches across an entire night. Unable to power the dinghy, Brian claims he drifted and paddled with a single oar for hour after hour across the Sea of Abaco. He did not reach land, by his account, until around 4 in the morning on April 5th, when he came ashore near the Marsh Harbour boatyard and finally told someone what had happened. That person alerted police. By the time authorities knew Lynette was in the water, more than 8 hours had passed since the moment her husband says she fell. The response was massive. The Royal Bahamas Police Force put patrol boats on the water. The Royal Bahamas Defence Force deployed vessels of its own. Volunteer fire and rescue crews from Hopetown mobilized. Drones swept the surface from above, while divers and submersible equipment probed beneath it, and the United States Coast Guard joined the effort from the air. For days, an international operation combed the stretch of sea between Hopetown and Elbow Cay, the exact area Brian had described. On April 8th, authorities made the devastating decision to transition from rescue to recovery, a formal acknowledgement that the chance of finding Lynette alive had all but disappeared. That same day, Bahamian police arrested Brian Hooker. From the very start, the people closest to Lynette struggled with the story. Her daughter, Carly Aylesworth, told CNN she could not understand the sequence of events. She asked why her mother, a strong swimmer with years of experience, would have been in that position at all, why the ignition key was on her person, and why Brian paddled away from the area instead of dropping anchor and searching where she went in. She said openly that the account never added up for her. Brian's attorney maintained that his client was cooperating fully, and after the legally permitted detention period expired, he was released on April 13th without charges. One day later came the television vow, and hours after that, the departure. For a while, the case seemed to drift, much like the story Brian had told. Then, the federal government stepped in, and everything accelerated. The United States Coast Guard Investigative Service opened a criminal investigation into Lynette's disappearance, and in early May, agents began asking the public for information, even releasing images of a sailboat that had been moored near the Soulmate in hopes of finding its owner. Behind the scenes, something far bigger was taking shape. Between May 8th and May 10th, the Soulmate quietly left the Bahamas and began the voyage back toward the United States. Carly Aylesworth said she was never notified that her mother's home was on the move. The vessel never completed the trip on its own terms. Roughly 40 nautical miles off Melbourne, Florida, the Coast Guard intercepted the sailboat on the open ocean, stopped it, boarded it, and seized it under federal authority as part of the criminal probe. Ashley Banfield obtained exclusive footage of that interception for drop Dead Serious, video showing the boat being brought in under escort, and she described the operation as a full interdiction at sea. For anyone watching the case, That was the moment the investigation visibly transformed from interviews and appeals into the physical seizure of evidence. The soulmate was towed to the Coast Guard station at Fort Pierce, Florida, where photographs obtained by Fox News Digital showed federal investigators working methodically across its deck, removing items, bagging and tagging materials, treating a family home like a crime scene. The vessel was later moved again, this time to Fort Lauderdale, where authorities had the equipment needed to haul the 46-foot boat completely out of the water and inspect everything below the waterline. According to reporting from NBC News and CBS News, evidence gathered in this case is being processed at the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, the same world-class facility the Bureau relies upon for its most complex and consequential investigations. Evidence does not travel to Quantico for routine matters. It goes there when the stakes are high, and the results need to withstand a courtroom. Investigators also collected DNA, reference samples from Lynette's family, with Carly confirming that she and Lynette's parents provided cheek swabs so that any biological material recovered from the boats could be compared against her mother's genetic profile. Then came the discovery that redirected the entire case. According to a United States official who spoke with CBS News and NBC News, forensic examiners extracted GPS data from one of Brian Hooker's electronic devices, reportedly tied to a marine navigation application on his phone. That data told its own story about the night of April 4th, and it was not the story Brian had told. The track showed the device traveling out onto the water, stopping at a specific point in the Sea of Abaco, and then returning. The official said that location did not align with the account Brian gave police. And here is the part that should stop you cold. Brian had personally provided maps to investigators. Maps, he said, showed the dinghy's route and the spot where Lynette went overboard. The independent data recovered from his own device pointed somewhere else entirely, to a place no search team had ever been sent. The official put it bluntly, saying Brian's version of events had caused crews to look in the wrong area of the sea. Fox News Digital added a further detail, reporting that the flagged position sat in water roughly 25 feet deep and that the dinghy had visited that area on the night in question. Absorb the practical weight of that for a moment. Every patrol boat, every diver, every drone, every volunteer who scoured the ocean in those first desperate days was operating off coordinates supplied by one man. If the federal analysis is correct, all of that urgency, all of those resources, and all of that hope were aimed at the wrong patch of water, while the location his own phone recorded sat unexamined. The data cannot explain why the device stopped where it did, or for how long, or what happened there. What it establishes, according to investigators, is a contradiction between the story and the record, and in a case like this, that contradiction changed everything. It triggered immediate action. American authorities formally asked the Bahamas for permission to return, and the request was granted. On June 2nd, the 154-foot Coast Guard cutter Margaret Norvell arrived at Marsh Harbor carrying federal investigators, specially trained dive teams, and a remotely operated underwater vehicle capable of mapping the seabed. Alongside them worked a cadaver dog named Maggie from the Broward County Sheriff's Office in Florida, an animal trained to detect human remains even beneath the surface of the ocean. Maggie was seen at the shoreline, aboard vessels, and near the restaurant where Brian and Lynette shared dinner on their final evening together, the last place anyone other than Brian reports seeing her alive. The Royal Bahamas Defense Force supported the operation on land and water. For days, divers descended into zones that had never been searched. The underwater vehicle scanned untouched sections of seabed, and teams retraced the route Brian described, comparing his timeline against the physical geography, step by step. On June 8th, the Coast Guard announced the operation had concluded. Lynette was not found, 81 days after she disappeared. Her family still has no remains to bury and no graveside to visit, a wound that stays open with every sunrise. But according to sources cited by multiple outlets, the mission was far from a failure. Investigators left the Bahamas with evidence packages formally transferred from Bahamian police into federal custody, and they took possession of the single most important object in this entire case, the 8-foot dinghy itself, which CBS News cameras captured being carried back to a Coast Guard cutter, with an agent aboard examining it and holding up a life jacket. Throughout all of it, one journalist kept getting there first. Ashley Banfield has broken development after development on drop, dead serious, often days ahead of the national networks that later confirmed her reporting. She aired the exclusive interception footage. She reported on a photograph showing calm water near the Soulmate during the very window, when Brian claimed violent seas threw his wife from the dinghy. She sat down with Lynette's mother, Darlene Hamlet, and her father, Dan Shepard, grieving parents who voiced their suspicions openly, with Dan delivering a message aimed directly at his son-in-law, saying that if this was not intentional, it was time to step forward and face up. Banfield has also reported that Brian is now refusing to cooperate with investigators in what sources describe as a suspected murder investigation, a development she examined with famed defense attorney Mark Garagos. And CBS News has reported that officials are treating this as a possible murder case, a classification that brings the full machinery of federal jurisdiction to bear on the death of an American abroad. Which brings us to the object we mentioned at the beginning, the one bolted to the mast that almost nobody knew about. According to Daniel Danforth, a friend who met the couple in New Orleans in 2023, the Soulmate carried a FLIR system, a forward-looking infrared camera worth approximately $33,000. Unlike an ordinary camera, this technology does not need light. It reads heat, distinguishing a human body from the cold water around it in total darkness. Danforth knew its capabilities firsthand, because Brian proudly demonstrated them, setting the detection threshold to 86 degrees and showing how the camera automatically locked onto Danforth's wife as she walked down the dock, tracking her movement with no human input whatsoever. Brian told his friend the system kept them completely safe. Now hold that image in your mind against the story Brian told police. A wife lost in a black ocean, an engine that would not start, 9 hours of helpless drifting, and sitting on the mast of the sailboat nearby, a machine specifically engineered to find a warm human body in dark water, a machine its owner understood intimately. Danforth told Fox News Digital that the thermal camera would have been his very first tool if someone he loved had gone overboard at night. Yet, by every available account, Brian never used it to search for Lynette, never mentioned it to Bahamian police, never raised it with the Coast Guard, and never brought it up during 5 days in custody. Federal agents did not even know the system existed until Danforth himself contacted them in early May. He says they were very interested, telling him it was the first they had heard of it, and that they intended to pursue a warrant using the camera's serial number. Danforth also revealed one more haunting detail. 2 days after the disappearance, Brian messaged him that Lynette had swum toward the sailboat after she fell, toward the very vessel carrying a camera built to see her. So, what did that device record on the night of April 4th? What has already been recovered from the dinghy, the sailboat, and the servers investigators have moved to access? And why would a man surrounded by tools designed to save his wife apparently reach for none of them? Those questions have answers. And in part 2, we are going to walk through what federal investigators found next, because this case is heading somewhere very few people saw coming. If this story gripped you the way it gripped us, do 2 quick things right now. Smash that like button so this case reaches more people, and subscribe to True Crime Vic with notifications turned on, because part 2 is coming, and you do not want to hear the rest of this story anywhere else. Until then, keep Lynette Hooker's name alive. Keep her family in your thoughts. And remember that somewhere out there, the truth is still waiting to surface. What happens when a man's own boat starts testifying against him? When the tracking system on his sailboat goes silent, at the exact hour, his wife disappears into the ocean. When a friendly phone call, recorded without his knowledge, captures him describing a night that sounds nothing like the one he reported to police. And what happens when the person raising the loudest alarm is not a detective or a journalist, but his own daughter, saying he warned this would happen years before it did? In part 1, we showed you how federal investigators turned a thin missing person file into a sprawling criminal probe. Tonight, we go deeper, into the electronic silence, the forensic science, the secret recording, and the family testimony that has pushed this investigation to the edge of something irreversible. Most people covering this case have shown you one piece. We are about to hand you the whole file. Before we dive in, if you have not already, hit that like button and subscribe to True Crime Vic right now, because this channel follows every development in this case, and the next update could be the biggest one yet. As always, everything you're about to hear comes from confirmed reporting by Fox News Digital, CBS News, NBC News, CNN, ABC News, News Nation, Ashley Banfield's Drop Dead Serious, and the reporting of News Nation's Brian Entin. Brian Hooker has denied all wrongdoing. Through his attorneys, he has not been charged with any crime, and he is presumed innocent. Where allegations appear in this story, so do his denials. We begin with a machine that was supposed to be boring. Every properly equipped vessel carries an automatic identification system, a transponder that quietly broadcasts the ship's identity, position, speed, and heading so that other boats and tracking services always know where it is. It is the maritime equivalent of a heartbeat monitor, steady, constant, unremarkable. Fox News Digital obtained the Soulmate's transmission records through the marine tracking company Vessel Finder, and those records revealed something that stopped investigators and observers cold. On the night of April 4th, the sailboat's signal went dark at 9:29 in the evening. It did not come back until 8:40 the next morning. More than 11 hours of electronic silence from the anchored vessel at the center of this case, covering almost the entire window in which Lynette Hooker vanished, and her husband says he drifted helplessly across the Sea of Abaco. Maritime law expert Kenneth Engerand, an adjunct professor at the University of Houston Law Center and a shareholder at the Brown Sims firm, examined that data for Fox News Digital and called the timing highly unusual. He explained that transponders can fail, but a catastrophic failure does not typically resolve itself. A system that stops transmitting and then resumes hours later, in his assessment, points toward being switched off or disabled. And the records held one more wrinkle. Between April 10th and April 13th, while Brian sat in Bahamian custody being questioned, the Soulmate's signal dropped out 3 additional times. Sit with one more piece of context alongside that blackout. Blaine Stevenson, a boating friend of the couple, told Fox News Digital that after Brian spent roughly 3 or 4 hours assisting rescue officials on April 5th, he returned to the Soulmate and remained aboard for about a full day. What happened on that vessel during those hours is a question investigators are now equipped to answer. Because, as we covered in Part 1, a thermal camera on the mast was uploading data to a server its owner cannot touch. From the sailboat, we turn to the smallest vessel in this story, and arguably the most important one. The 8-foot hard-bottom dinghy is where Brian's entire account begins and ends. In his version, given to Bahamian authorities, the couple departed Hopetown around 7:30 that evening. Rough conditions caused Lynette to bounce off the back and into the sea while carrying the engine's safety lanyard, which disabled the motor. He said the current pulled her from view quickly, that he tossed her a flotation cushion without knowing whether she caught it, that he set an anchor, fired flares, and then drifted for hour after hour until he washed up near Marsh Harbour around 4 in the morning. There, according to an account a boatyard security guard named Edward Smith gave Fox News Digital, an exhausted man appeared asking for water, explained that 2 flares had gone unanswered, and described where the couple had. Earlier that evening, Smith contacted police, and the search machinery of two nations began to turn. Here is why that little boat matters so much. It is the final surface on which anyone claims Lynette was alive. If Brian's account is true, the dinghy witnessed a tragedy. If it is not, the dinghy witnessed whatever actually occurred. Either way, physics does not forget. During the June operation, the Coast Guard took custody of the dinghy and transferred it to the United States for examination. A seizure, first reported by CBS News and confirmed by CNN, with cameras capturing a federal investigator aboard the small craft, studying its surfaces and lifting a life jacket while Maggie the cadaver dog worked nearby. Understand what modern forensics can extract from an object like that, even months later. Chemical reagents, such as luminol, react with the iron in hemoglobin, glowing faintly wherever blood has been, in traces far too small for the human eye. Scrubbing does not defeat it. Salt water does not defeat it. The residue settles into microscopic pores and textures and stays there, and specialists can read the resulting patterns well enough to distinguish a drip from a smear from an impact. Swabbing recovers biological material from seams, bolt heads, screw threads, and textured flooring, places nearly impossible to clean completely, and laboratories amplify those samples into full genetic profiles. Those profiles are then measured against the reference swabs that Carly Aylesworth and Lynette's parents provided to investigators. Even the scratches, dents and abrasions on a hull can indicate what forces acted on a boat, and whether those forces match a rough water story. Whatever the night of April 4th wrote onto that dinghy, federal specialists are now reading it, and the seriousness of that effort is written into the government's own language. When the Coast Guard formally announced taking the Soulmate, its release described a complex surveillance and interdiction operation coordinated between its investigative, surface assets from Sector Miami, and aviation units overhead, revealing that federal agents had been quietly watching the sailboat's movements before they ever moved on it. After the boarding, the vessel lost engine power and had to be towed by the cutter Winslow Greaser before a Fort Pierce crew brought it through the inlet. Agencies do not choreograph multi-asset operations at sea, or announce them in those terms, for routine property transfers. They do it when they believe the object they are securing may hold answers a courtroom will one day need, preserved under an unbroken chain of custody from ocean to laboratory. While the laboratories work, the reporting around Brian's narrative has been steadily eroding its foundations. Banfield published a photograph on Drop Dead Sirius, showing the water near the Soulmate appearing calm during the very period when Brian claims violent seas hurled his wife from the boat. If the sea was placid, the premise underneath his entire account weakens. She also reported the account of a witness who described hearing an enormous splash near the anchored sailboat at roughly 9:30 that night. Notice where that places a disturbance. Not along the open crossing where Brian located the accident, but beside the Soulmate itself. And notice the clock. The vessel's tracking signal, according to the vessel finder records, went dark at 9:29. Those are two separate details from two separate sources, and we present them side by side without connecting them, because we do not have to. You can hold them next to each other yourself. The contradictions kept stacking. Jim Todd, a Hopetown volunteer firefighter, and among the first responders to encounter Brian at Marsh Harbour, told Banfield's audience that central elements of his description of reaching shore struck him as impossible to believe. Banfield walked viewers through footage of the terrain Brian claimed to have crossed, miles of scrub and mangrove in darkness, and questioned whether the landscape matched the journey he described. Carly Aylesworth added her own observation about the voicemail Brian left her afterward, describing his tone as flat and relaxed, nothing like a man whose wife had just been lost to the ocean. All of that is circumstantial texture. What came next was different in kind, because it was Brian's voice, speaking freely, with no idea anyone would ever replay it. 2 days after Lynette vanished, Brian telephoned Blaine Stevenson, the fellow cruiser he and Lynette had befriended near Bradenton, Florida, in late 2023. Stevenson took the call, hoping to gather details that might help the search. Instead, he later told News Nation, he found the story shifting shape as it was being told, details rearranging themselves mid-conversation, references to the sunset that clashed with the established departure time, claims about flares that raised their own timing problems. He checked with contacts in the Bahamas who confirmed weather did move through that night, but not, in his understanding, at the hour Brian's account required. Struggling to keep the moving pieces straight, Stevenson began recording, saying later that he did so purely to organize information for the people looking for Lynette. What that recording preserved is now among the most scrutinized material in this case. Remember the architecture of the official account. Lynette goes into the sea. Brian stays aboard. She drifts one way, he drifts another, and the gap between them becomes permanent. It is a story of separation, with Brian dry and helpless the entire time. On the call, released publicly and reported by Fox News Digital and News Nation, Brian described waves swamping the dinghy, bailing out the cockpit, repeatedly, a flare pistol, the interior soaked, the key unattached to his body, and then a phrase that does not belong anywhere in the story he told police. He referred to when they were, in his words, trying to get back in the boat. Both of them getting back in. Fox News Digital reported that the remark appears to place Brian himself in the water that night, which is a scenario his official account never included and cannot absorb. On the same recording, he elsewhere described himself as inside the dinghy throughout, shipping the oars, losing one over the side, anchoring, yelling into the dark. The two descriptions sit within a single conversation, and they describe two different nights. Engerand reviewed Brian's assorted statements for Fox News Digital and delivered a methodical assessment. He observed that Brian claimed to be bailing out a swamped boat at the same moment his wife was supposedly being carried away, two circumstances that demand his attention in two different places at once. He counted what he characterized as 5 distinct versions of events across Brian's various accounts, none consistent with the others, and said the discrepancies were not the small memory slips that trauma produces, but structural incompatibilities, different stories describing different kinds of incidents. In his view, it sounded like a narrative being assembled in real time. His summary of the case's direction was blunt, describing it as growing more damning by the minute. Those are his professional characterizations offered to Fox, and we present them as exactly that. Stevenson, for his part, told News Nation he released the recording to help find Lynette, not to convict anyone, and voiced frustration that every criminal development pulls focus from the search itself. But the recording now lives in the federal file, where it is being measured against the GPS tracks, the dinghy forensics, the tracking blackout, and the thermal data investigators move to unlock. Then there is Brian's conduct since he flew home. The man who pledged on national television to devote himself entirely to the search was later reported by Banfield to have been spotted at a Sierra store in Grand Rapids, Michigan, shopping alongside his daughter Rosie, 1,000 miles from the waters where Lynette disappeared. Additional reporting traced his movements through California and Oregon, painting a picture of someone in constant motion. A person described to Fox News Digital as a close friend expressed astonishment that a man of his stature and distinctive appearance had moved through public spaces, largely unrecognized. And Darlene Hamlet, Lynette's mother, sitting down with Banfield alongside her husband Bill, disclosed the existence of an off-the-grid cabin connected to Brian's family, a detail whose investigative significance has not been publicly explained, but whose mention added yet another question about his resources and whereabouts. The most consequential shift broken by Banfield was this. Sources confirmed to her that Brian is now refusing to cooperate with federal investigators in what those sources describe as a suspected murder investigation. That represents a complete reversal. Through April, his Bahamian counsel emphasized his full cooperation, and his Michigan attorney, Crystal Marie Hauser, publicly asked Americans to extend him the benefit of the doubt. Banfield examined the change with famed defense attorney Mark Garagos, and their discussion drew no legal conclusions, because none can be drawn. Silence is every citizen's constitutional right, and exercising it proves nothing. What it unmistakably signals is that the relationship between Brian Hooker and the investigators trying to determine what happened to his wife has fundamentally transformed. And then his family began to speak. In an interview with News Nation's Brian Entin, Carly Hooker, described by that outlet as the couple's daughter, made the most serious allegations in this entire case. She said her father had threatened, on multiple occasions over the years, to do precisely what she believes happened to Lynette, and recounted her mother once confiding that Brian had choked her and threatened to kill her and throw her overboard. Lynette left after that fight, Carly said, only to return a couple of months later. Her conclusion was chilling in its simplicity, telling Entin, "He said he was going to do this, and now it's happening." Separately, Carly Aylesworth told CNN her mother had confided a similar choking incident during what she described as a turbulent marriage. These allegations demand equally clear balance. CNN reported it could not independently confirm the choking account with law enforcement. Attorney Terrell Butler stated that Brian denies the allegations, and that when police confronted him with them during questioning, he disputed them directly. There is also a documented episode from 2015 in Michigan, and the record there is more complicated than social media suggests. According to a Kentwood police report cited by CNN, it was Lynette who was taken into custody on suspicion of assault after Brian reported being struck in the face, with an officer noting his injuries. The matter produced conflicting accounts and no prosecution. Honest coverage requires acknowledging that the documented history cuts in more than one direction, and that none of it establishes what happened on April 4th. One final thread points somewhere unexpected, not toward the Bahamas, but backward toward Michigan. In June, News Nation's Brian Entin reported, based on a family friend, that federal law enforcement has taken interest in camera footage recorded in Michigan before the Hookers ever departed on their voyage. What the footage shows, and where it was captured, remains undisclosed. We will not speculate about its contents. We will simply observe the obvious. Investigators examining a boating accident do not ordinarily need recordings from 1,000 miles away, made before the trip began. Interest in that material suggests the timeline being constructed does not start on a dinghy in the dark. It starts earlier, on land, and it is being built from both ends toward the middle. 81 days. That is how long Lynette Hooker has been gone. Strip away the seizures, the warrants, the recordings and the experts, and what remains is a 55-year-old woman who chose a life most people only dream about. A mother who stayed close to her daughter across thousands of miles of open water. A daughter who never let distance loosen her grip on her parents. A sailor who loved the ocean enough to make it her address. And a friend remembered as the first to arrive and the last to leave whenever someone needed help. Carly boarded the Soulmate after it reached Florida and told ABC News the experience felt eerie, sitting on the deck and speaking to her mother as though she might still answer. Darlene has vowed she is not going away, and neither, she says, is the Coast Guard. Dan Shepard, Lynette's father, distilled 81 days of anguish into a single plea aimed at his son-in-law, asking him, if this was not intentional, to step forward and face it. No grave, no remains, no answer, only a family holding its breath, and somewhere on a protected server, a thermal record that may have watched the whole night unfold, waiting for investigators to press play. So what do you believe that camera captured near the Soulmate on the night of April 4th? Drop your theory in the comments, because this community catches details others miss. Then do two things before you go. Tap that like button so this coverage reaches more people, and subscribe to True Crime Vic with notifications on, because the moment this case breaks again, we will be the first place you hear it. This video was produced for informational purposes. All material is drawn from confirmed reporting by the outlets named throughout. Brian Hooker has been charged with no crime, has denied all wrongdoing through his legal representatives, and is presumed innocent under the law. Nothing here is a determination of guilt. Until next time, keep Lynette Hooker in your thoughts, and keep asking the questions her family deserves to have answered.